the discovery that changed history. High in the Ötzi Alps, straddling the border between Italy and Austria, a chance discovery in 1991 reshaped everything scientists thought they knew about ancient Europe. Two German hikers, Erika and Helmut Simon, were navigating the melting ice fields when they stumbled upon something that looked at first like debris from a climber's accident. But as they drew closer, it became clear this was no ordinary find. What they saw was a human body, partially sticking out of the ice, preserved in chilling perfection. His skin was darkened, leathery, and tattooed. His clothes and tools were still intact. They had unknowingly discovered what would soon be called Ötzi the Iceman, a 300-year-old natural mummy, frozen in time. What made this find extraordinary was not just its age, but its completeness. Unlike Egyptian mummies, Otzi had not been intentionally preserved. He was frozen by nature, sealed in ice after dying in the mountains. Everything he carried, his copper axe, flint knife, unfinished bow, leather boots, grass cloak, and even the contents of his stomach, were snapshots of daily life during the Copper Age. It was as if time had simply paused around him, and then thawed just enough to reveal his existence to the modern world. When Ötzi was first studied, scientists realized they had before them something far more valuable than bones or artifacts, a story about survival, migration, and the harsh realities of prehistoric life. CT scans revealed arrow wounds, bruises, and fractured bones, suggesting his death had been violent rather than accidental. Pollen grains in his stomach pointed to a last meal eaten in spring, hours before his murder. His copper axe revealed not only skilled craftsmanship, but also access to metal smelting technology, far ahead of what had been expected for his region. Each clue turned Ötzi from a frozen corpse into a living person, a man who had walked, hunted, eaten, and fought like anyone else more than 5 millennia ago. But Ötzi's significance did not stop with his possessions or even his injuries. With advances in genetics, scientists extracted DNA from his bones and teeth. The first results stunned the world. Otzi was not just an isolated wanderer. His genetic makeup could be compared to modern populations. Early DNA studies suggested links to present-day people in Sardinia and Corsica, rather than to those in the Alps where he was found. This implied something remarkable. Ötzi's ancestors had migrated from the Mediterranean, carrying with them farming knowledge, metalworking skills, and cultural traditions that would shape early Europe. Still, mysteries lingered. Why did his DNA look different from the Alpine populations who came later? Was he part of a small, isolated community cut off from neighbors? Or did his people represent a wave of migration that was eventually replaced? For decades, the answers were debated and theories multiplied. Now, more than 30 years after his discovery, a groundbreaking new study has revisited Otzi's genome with the latest sequencing technology, comparing it not just to ancient DNA samples, but also to the wider genetic pool of his prehistoric neighbors. The results are rewriting the story once again, and revealing a twist nobody saw coming. The updated research paints a picture of a man more genetically distinct than anyone had expected. Where earlier studies suggested he shared close ties with Mediterranean farmers, the new sequencing reveals Ötzi was almost completely lacking the genetic influence of steppe herders who swept into Europe around 5,000 years ago and transformed the continent's population. His DNA was a time capsule, almost pure early European farmer ancestry, untouched by later migrations that shaped much of modern Europe. This discovery has set scientists on edge, forcing them to rethink the social networks and population dynamics of Copper Age Europe. But the surprises do not stop there. Alongside his DNA, Ötzi's physical appearance and health traits also reveal a new side to him that earlier reconstructions missed. Far from the lighter-skinned, brown-eyed mountain man once imagined, Ötzi's genetics point to darker skin, balding hair, and a higher risk of heart disease. Suddenly, the image of the Iceman has shifted, not just scientifically but culturally. He is no longer the rugged, light-skinned alpine traveler of old museum models. He is something far more complex and unexpected. The discovery of Ötzi was never just about a frozen corpse. It was about rewriting the prehistory of Europe, piece by piece. And with each layer of genetic research, scientists are learning that the story of migration, survival, and identity in the ancient world is far more intricate than anyone could have imagined, shattering old assumptions about Otzi's identity. For decades, Otzi was presented to the public in a way that fit the expectations of both scientists and popular imagination. Museum reconstructions showed him with pale skin, thick dark hair, and a rugged mountain man appearance, an image that reflected what people assumed prehistoric Europeans must have looked like. This image became iconic, etched into documentaries, textbooks, and cultural memory. But new DNA sequencing has dismantled that vision entirely, forcing experts to admit that even their most confident assumptions were wrong. The latest genetic analysis, conducted with far more advanced technology than what was available in the 1990s and early 2000s, shows that Otzi did not have light skin at all. In fact, he likely had one of the darkest complexions of any ancient European discovered to date. His pigmentation genes suggest a skin tone closer to modern populations in the Mediterranean or Middle East than the pale alpine look that had long been assigned to him. This revelation alone shocked researchers because it meant early Europeans retained darker skin far longer than previously believed. The surprise did not end there. Earlier reconstructions had shown Otzi with a full head of thick hair, almost as though he had been frozen in his prime. But the new DNA results, combined with microscopic analysis of his scalp, revealed a completely different truth. Otzi was balding, at just about 45 years old when he died, a respectable but not elderly age in his time. He was already losing his hair, and his genetic profile indicated a strong predisposition to male pattern baldness. The iconic mountain survivor with flowing locks now had to be reimagined as a man with thinning hair, a detail that makes him feel surprisingly human, even relatable, across the gulf of 5,000 years. Even his eyes, once thought to be a lighter color, were likely dark brown. Put together, this new portrait presents a very different figure from the one most people have grown accustomed to. Far from being an alpine prototype of northern Europeans, Otzi seems to represent an older population lineage, one rooted in early farming communities that came out of the Near East and spread agriculture into Europe during the Neolithic period. These farmers brought wheat, domesticated animals, and metal tools. But unlike later populations, they had not yet mixed with the steppe herders whose genetic signature dominates most of modern Europe. This finding complicates the story of European ancestry. For years, the dominant theory held that Otzi and his people were similar to their neighbors, gradually mixing with incoming groups to form the genetic foundation of Europeans today. But Otzi's genome shows little to no trace of that mixing. He was a relic of an older population that was on the verge of disappearing. In fact, experts now believe his community was so isolated in the Alps that it remained genetically untouched for generations, maintaining ancient farmer DNA in its purest form. His discovery is not just a window into one man's life. It is a snapshot of an entire people who left very few descendants in the genetic record. This isolation might explain more than just his DNA. It could also reveal why Otzi carried certain health risks. The genetic study found that he was predisposed to cardiovascular disease, a risk factor that might have been amplified in a small, isolated community with little genetic diversity. His arteries were already calcifying, even at a relatively young age, making him vulnerable to strokes or heart attacks. Add to this his physical injuries, broken ribs, signs of infection, and the arrow wound that likely killed him, and Otzi emerges not as a mythic mountain hero, but as a man weighed down by hardship, age, and genetic fragility. The reimagining of Otzi is not just a matter of cosmetic detail. It forces scientists to rethink how prehistoric Europeans looked, lived, and interacted. For years, the assumption was that alpine populations were an early version of what would become northern Europeans. Lighter-skinned, lighter-eyed, adapted to the mountains. But Otzi's darker complexion and farmer ancestry suggest something more complex. Europe was not a uniform place, but a patchwork of peoples, some of whom left descendants while others vanished. The new twist is that Ötzi belonged to one of those fading groups, and his frozen body is a final testimony to their existence. The implications go even further. If Otzi's people were genetically isolated, it raises questions about how they interacted with their neighbors. Were they trading and mingling, or did they deliberately remain apart? Did they see themselves as separate, guarding their traditions and ways of life in the high valleys of the Alps? And what did it mean for their survival when larger, more mobile populations began moving into Europe? One thing is clear. The old image of Otzi as a rugged mountain prototype has crumbled. What stands in its place is something richer, stranger, and more unsettling. A man whose very DNA tells the story of a people disappearing in the face of massive population shifts. And the new research is not finished yet, because when scientists compared Otzi's genetic profile to those of other ancient remains in the region, they stumbled upon a mystery that deepens the intrigue even further. Comparing Otzi to his neighbors, one of the most startling outcomes of the new DNA study did not come simply from sequencing Otzi's genome, but from comparing it to the genetic records of his prehistoric neighbors. Archaeologists have unearthed other skeletons from the same period across Europe, burials in Germany, France, and even nearby alpine valleys. These remains have provided valuable insights into how populations mixed, migrated, and replaced each other during the turbulent centuries of the Copper Age. When researchers lined up Otzi's DNA against these samples, the contrast was striking. Most of the other individuals from Central and Northern Europe showed clear evidence of steppe ancestry, the genetic signature of nomadic herders who swept in from the Eurasian grasslands around 3000 BCE. These steppe migrants carried with them new technologies, languages, and lifestyles. They introduced horses, wheeled vehicles, and different burial traditions. Most importantly, their DNA rapidly spread across the continent, blending with the older farmer populations that had settled Europe thousands of years earlier. By the Bronze Age, steppe ancestry had become a dominant genetic force in Europe. Yet Otzi's DNA told a different story. He carried almost no trace of steppe ancestry. His genetic profile was almost entirely descended from the earlier wave of Neolithic farmers who had spread into Europe from Anatolia and the Near East. While his neighbors were already beginning to show signs of this sweeping genetic transformation, Ötzi and his community stood apart, locked in a genetic bubble that seemed untouched by the great population upheaval happening elsewhere. This raised a profound question. Why was Otzi's group so different? The answer may lie in the geography of the Alps. The mountain valleys were isolated, difficult to access, and challenging to inhabit. Communities there may have had limited contact with the larger, more mobile groups moving across the plains. In this isolation, they preserved the genetic signature of Europe's earliest farmers, long after those farmers had been absorbed elsewhere. In other words, Otzi's people were a living time capsule of an older Europe, a cultural and genetic pocket that resisted the changes sweeping across the continent. But isolation also came at a cost. Compared to their neighbors, Otzi's group may have had fewer opportunities to exchange not just genes but also ideas, resources, and technologies. While other communities were adopting new tools, weapons, and methods brought by the steppe herders, the alpine farmers were clinging to their older ways. Otzi's copper axe, remarkable as it was, may represent the pinnacle of their technology rather than a sign of widespread innovation. His unfinished bow suggests a people still relying heavily on traditional hunting methods, even as others were experimenting with new techniques. The comparison also revealed cultural differences. Burial practices in steppe influenced regions involved grand kurgan mounds, often filled with weapons and ornaments, reflecting a warrior ethos. By contrast, Otzi's death left him frozen in a lonely mountain pass, with no formal burial, no ceremonial send-off, and no markers of elite status. While we cannot be certain, this contrast suggests that Gusai's society may have been smaller, more egalitarian, or simply less influenced by the hierarchical, warrior-based cultures rising elsewhere. Yet the DNA study uncovered something even more unsettling. When Otzi's genome was compared to modern Europeans, it became clear that his lineage had left very little impact. Most Europeans today carry a significant mix of steppe and Neolithic farmer ancestry, but Otzi's unique genetic profile is rare, surviving only faintly in isolated populations, particularly in places like Sardinia. This suggests that his people were not only isolated during his lifetime, but also marginalized in the centuries that followed, ultimately disappearing as Europe's genetic landscape shifted dramatically. For scientists, this comparison has profound implications. It challenges the long-standing idea that ancient populations blended smoothly into one another. Instead, it reveals a more fragmented, uneven process. Some groups thrived and expanded, spreading their genes across continents. Others, like Otzi's, remained isolated and eventually faded away, leaving behind only traces, and in his case, one extraordinary frozen body to tell their story. This discovery reframes Otzi's role in history. He is no longer just a fascinating individual or even just a representative of Copper Age life. He is the last witness of a disappearing world, a genetic outlier whose existence exposes the complexity of Europe's prehistoric past. His body, preserved by chance in the ice, survived when his people's culture and DNA did not. That survival is what allows us today to peer into the forgotten corner of Europe's story that his community represents. But the more scientists uncovered about his genetic isolation, the more they began to wonder about the circumstances of his life and death. Was his murder connected to this marginal position in the wider prehistoric world? Was he caught in the tensions between old communities and new arrivals? And what could his DNA tell us about his health, his diet, and the struggles he faced every day as a man straddling the edge of survival and extinction? Health, diet, and the strain of survival. Otzi's DNA has not only redrawn the map of Europe's prehistoric ancestry, it has also opened a window into his personal health and the daily struggles he faced as a man of the Copper Age. If the genetic comparisons revealed how different he was from his neighbors, the health data painted an equally dramatic portrait of his fragile body, worn down by genetics, environment, and violence. The new sequencing confirmed what earlier studies had hinted at. Otzi was predisposed to cardiovascular disease. Even though he lived a physically demanding life in the mountains, his arteries already showed signs of calcification by the time of his death around the age of 45. This was unusual in a world without processed foods, smoking, or modern sedentary lifestyles. It suggested that his genes carried an inherent risk, one that no amount of activity could fully protect against. In an isolated community with little genetic diversity, such inherited health risks may have been common, slowly undermining the vitality of his people. But clogged arteries were not the only issue Otzi carried within him. Genetic markers also revealed lactose intolerance, meaning he could not digest dairy. This trait made sense in his context, as milk consumption only became widespread in Europe centuries later with the arrival of steppe herders. For Otzi, whose community had little genetic mixing, milk would have been more of a curse than a benefit. His diet, reconstructed from the contents of his stomach and intestines, reflected this reality. He ate grains like einkorn wheat, dried meats, herbs, and wild plants. His last meal, fatty ibex meat and unleavened bread, was hearty but simple, designed to fuel long journeys across the Alps. Scientists also found evidence of parasites inside his body. Whipworm eggs were discovered in his intestines, suggesting he suffered from stomach discomfort or digestive issues. His fingernails revealed signs of chronic stress, with lines marking periods of illness or malnutrition. Even his teeth bore evidence of a rough life, with cavities and significant wear from grinding coarse, stone-contaminated flour. Far from being an invincible mountain survivor, Otzi was a man carrying the constant burdens of prehistoric life parasites, infections, hunger, and genetic vulnerabilities. The physical toll on his body was clear. He had broken ribs that had partially healed, suggesting past accidents or fights. His joints showed signs of arthritis, a painful condition likely aggravated by the rugged alpine terrain he navigated daily. CT scans revealed a shoulder injury, evidence of the fatal arrow wound that pierced him from behind, but also other scars that hinted at a lifetime of conflict. His body told the story of someone who lived on the edge, both physically and socially. And then there was the question of tattoos. Otzi's skin carried more than 60 tattoo markings, arranged in lines and crosses across his back, legs, and ankles. Initially thought to be decorative, new research suggests these tattoos may have been therapeutic, applied near areas of pain to relieve arthritis or other ailments. If true, Otzi's tattoos make him one of the earliest known examples of acupuncture-like treatment. His community may have practiced a form of proto-medicine, desperately trying to ease the suffering that came with age and hard labor. Taken together, his genetic and physical profile shows a man trapped between endurance and decline. He had survived long enough to become middle-aged in a harsh world, but his body was breaking down. His clogged arteries, painful joints, and chronic illnesses would have made every climb more difficult and every hunt more exhausting. Yet he pressed on, carrying weapons, tools, and food through a mountain pass on the day he died. The question that lingers is whether his declining health played a role in his murder. Was he seen as vulnerable, easy prey for an enemy, or even for someone within his community? Did his isolation, both genetic and geographical, make his group more prone to internal conflicts as resources grew scarce? His final hours, reconstructed from forensic evidence, suggest he was pursued, attacked, and struck down violently. Perhaps his weakened state made him unable to defend himself, turning him into a victim of forces larger than his own will to survive. What makes Otzi so fascinating is that his body is not just a relic, it is a testimony. Every scar, every parasite, and every artery tells us something about life in the Copper Age. It shows us a world where survival meant carrying the weight of genetic risks, infections, and constant physical strain, and it raises a chilling thought: if Otzi, preserved so perfectly by ice, suffered so deeply, how many others lived and died in the shadows of history without leaving a trace? As scientists pieced together the story of his health and diet, they began to connect it with something else hidden in his DNA: his appearance, his ancestry, and even his role in the violent world of prehistoric Europe. And when they placed all the pieces together, the picture that emerged was not just one of a sick man in decline, but of a society on the brink of vanishing, a violent death in the frozen pass. Otzi's body may have survived the ice for 300 years, but the circumstances of his death remain one of the greatest mysteries of European prehistory. From the moment his arrow wound was discovered during scans in the early 2000s, experts have debated whether his end was the result of an ambush, a ritual killing, or a conflict gone wrong. The latest DNA analysis, when combined with forensic evidence from his body and belongings, suggests a chilling possibility: Otzi may have died not as a random traveler, but as a man entangled in the violent struggles of his age. The evidence begins with the arrow. Lodged in his left shoulder, the projectile had pierced a major artery, leading to rapid blood loss. Death would have come within minutes, possibly even seconds. Forensic analysis confirmed that the arrow was shot from behind, likely from a short distance. This was not a hunting accident. It was a deliberate act of violence. But the questions are who shot it and why. Blood samples recovered from his weapons provided another clue. On his dagger and clothing, scientists identified blood from at least 4 different individuals, suggesting he had been in combat shortly before his death. Some of these traces were on the shaft of his arrow, hinting that he may have pulled his weapon from an opponent's body during the fight. Far from being a defenseless wanderer, Otzi appears to have been engaged in a deadly struggle, one that left both his attackers and himself wounded. The fact that his body was found in such a remote mountain pass raises further intrigue. Was he fleeing from enemies, making his way across the Alps to safety? Or was he ambushed while traveling a familiar route? The items he carried seemed to point toward survival, not leisure. His unfinished bow, quiver full of arrows, dagger, and copper axe suggest he was prepared for conflict or at least wary of it. He also carried food, bread, meat, and herbs, indicating he expected a long journey. Yet the fatal arrow wound suggests he never reached his destination. One theory proposes that Ötzi was the victim of inter-community violence. In a time when resources were scarce and groups often competed for territory, raids and ambushes were not uncommon. Otzi, possibly already weakened by age and illness, may have been caught in the crossfire of a broader conflict between his people and neighboring groups. His genetic distinctiveness from nearby populations, lacking steppe ancestry that others in Europe were beginning to carry, adds a fascinating dimension to this theory. Could his community's isolation have made them targets? Perhaps his people resisted contact with outsiders, and this resistance led to violence. Another possibility is that Otzi's death was personal rather than political. Forensic analysis of his hand revealed a deep cut on his thumb, sustained days before his death. This injury may have come from a fight, suggesting he was already involved in conflict before he was fatally shot. If so, his journey into the mountains may not have been a simple crossing but an escape, an attempt to flee pursuers who finally caught up with him in the high pass. And then there is the copper axe. This object has puzzled scientists since it was first recovered. At the time, copper tools were extremely valuable, signs of wealth and prestige. If Otzi was murdered for his belongings, why did his killer not take the axe? The fact that it remained by his side suggests the killer's motive was not robbery but something more personal.